Hi, my name is Conor Friedersdorf. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic.
And I'm Mark Joseph Stern. I'm a writer for Slate magazine.
It's good to have you back on Blogging Heads, Mark. And let's start off by talking about a story that you sent to me about I guess it's a gay marriage lawsuit where a church is actually wanting to perform gay marriage. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Why don't you lay out the story and then we can talk about it?
So it's a very interesting lawsuit because it doesn't follow the pattern of every other gay marriage lawsuit, and I think we're up to 47 states now, because the United Church of Christ brought this lawsuit and said, our inability to perform gay marriages is violating equal protection, due process, all the basic stuff. But then it added this complaint, this very interesting grievance that North Carolina marriage law, was violating the church's First Amendment rights of free speech and free exercise of religion because they discovered, and I didn't know this until I read this article, in North Carolina it is illegal for a minister to perform a marriage ceremony for a couple that does not have a valid marriage license. And North Carolina law forbids gay couples from obtaining a valid marriage license. So the United Church of Christ is saying, and it's clearly true, that if their ministers perform a gay marriage ceremony for a gay couple who is not legally married, that they can be arrested for it, which is sort of startling. I don't think a lot of people realize this was the state of the law. But North Carolina is not the only state where that's true. We know it was at least true of New York State before that state legalized gay marriage. And so the lawsuit just brings up, in addition to the usual series of questions about gay marriage, it brings up a lot of interesting questions about religious liberty, not just religious liberty for people who don't approve of gay marriage, but religious liberty for people who do approve of gay marriage and want to actually perform gay marriages.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this until I read your story, and it actually surprised me. I thought, why wasn't this a strategy in the movement for marriage equality before? Why wasn't a church sort of created to make this very point that if marriage is in fact something that religious groups ought to be able to solemnize, then surely a religious group could come along and say that gay marriage is consistent with their religious beliefs.
Well, I know some religious groups have been at the forefront of the gay marriage battle. So Unitarian, Universalists have always been right at the forefront. So have Reformed Jews, I think Buddhists as well in America. So there have been some religious groups who have been making that argument. But I think the reason we haven't seen a lawsuit like this one is because there aren't a whole lot of states that actually forbid just a marriage ceremony between a same-sex couple. I mean, of course, throughout the 80s and 90s, you heard about commitment ceremonies, which were memorably described on Will and Grace as when some lesbian waves a stick over you at a beach. And no one ever thought that commitment ceremonies were illegal to perform by a church, right? No one ever thought that could even be a possibility. But it turns out that there are these laws on the books that these churches have discovered that place them at serious risk of arrest if they do perform even, just a celebration of a same-sex couple's love that they consider to be a marriage.
It's interesting to me, in part because one critique I've always had of gay marriage opponents is what I think of as their inability to separate the notion of sacramental religious marriage and civil marriage.
Yes,
I agree. And this seems like it's almost a flipped instance where suddenly in this case they are able to separate it.
Yes, I thought that was a very keen irony of the situation in North Carolina. It sort of turns the tables on the usual narrative.
Well, so this does raise a question. Both of us are gay marriage supporters, but I suppose someone on the other side might question whether this is actually a religious belief of this congregation. I guess it raises the question of can a new practice have religious protection under the First Amendment? If it's not something that was traditionally part of this religion, even if believers of a religion earnestly think that some new thing ought to be so in society, that they ought to do something in society, what can you add to a religion? Because I have no reason to doubt the earnestness of these people, that they perhaps believe that they're compelled by their religious belief, by their religious conscience to perform these marriage ceremonies. I kind of want them to win given my overall loyalties on this issue. At the same time, you can imagine religious groups, getting away with all sorts of things if they can add aspects of, claim that something is an aspect of religious belief that they have never claimed before, that hasn't traditionally been part of their faith.
Right, so this was the big question in the famous Smith case, Smith v. Employment Division, that I'm sure you're familiar with. The case where the Supreme Court said, no, if you're a religious group and you have some practice that you want to partake in that case it was Native Americans taking peyote, I think, you don't get to say, oh, but we're religious and this is our religious belief, and so this is our free exercise right. If there is a generally applicable law that applies to everyone equally, then there is no reason and no real constitutional right for you to come along and say, oh, but I'm exempted from that. Right. However, the law in North Carolina explicitly targets ministers. It specifically says that a minister who performs a marriage ceremony for a couple that does not have a valid marriage license can be arrested for and thrown in jail for 45 days. So to me, that seems to move beyond the usual questions of, oh, is this just an excuse? Is this a sincerely held religious belief? And this seems to move into a very alarming realm of the government encroaching upon free exercise of religion in a quite fundamental way. I mean, right. I understand your qualm. When did the United Church of Christ decide that gay marriage was, okay with it? But I question whether that's even something that we should be wondering about, whether it's something we should be skeptical about, because this is a law that targets the practice of religion within the confines of an actual church. So to me, that moves so far into the sphere of liberty that religious groups are afforded by our Constitution that it's overwhelming.
Yeah, I actually don't doubt that it makes intuitive sense to me that there would be a church out there somewhere that would want to solemnize gay marriages for what they would say are Christian reasons. Perhaps naively, I'm surprised that more religious Christians don't come to that conclusion. I do just I'm just trying to think of a general rule that you would use to adjudicate these cases, because they're really tough. And I think actually that I'm sure that religious beliefs that I wouldn't want to be covered by the First Amendment, if I were, some kind of petty dictator who just went along making every call in accordance with my wishes on that subject, right? There's probably some tenet of Scientology, say, that I would think definitely falls under what is a religion, and yet strikes me as perhaps harmful in some way. So I don't know. I wonder. I wonder how we're going to see this area of law play out in the future. I think that in the United States, we've been a majority Christian nation for so long that we're going to see a lot of interesting things happen now that that's no longer so, and Christian faiths evolve and different faiths begin to have enough political power to actually think that they could maybe succeed in this sort of challenge.
So I think one answer to your question of how do you adjudicate these cases is to take the pretty narrow principle that I don't think anybody would doubt, which is that you cannot specifically target a religion for disfavored treatment. You can't target a specific religion, you can't target a specific religious practice just because it's a religious practice and legalize it on those grounds. I think that a statute like that could be pretty easily invalidated. And so I would say this North Carolina statute is easily invalidated on the basis of the fact that it specifically says a minister, which entails a Christian minister, right? It is a position in any Christian congregation, and it seems to specify the precise religious figure who cannot perform a precise religious action. That seems to me to be so specific and such an obvious encroachment on free exercise that it can be invalidated without calling into question the broader issue of, well, when should we afford religious groups a little extra leeway to do what they think is necessary for their religion?
Right.
So that's an answer to that question. But I definitely have some concerns about where we're going with Scientologists. Who knows what they do? There's a Scientology center 3 blocks from my house. I have no idea what they do in there. There are people coming and going. They look like, they're dressed in very odd clothes. I don't want to discriminate against Scientologists, but they certainly have beliefs and practices that might violate different laws. I know there's been talk of them performing different therapies that might violate state laws. And so how far are we going to go in saying, oh, if you are performing some kind of electroshock therapy that is otherwise invalid, that cannot be performed under this state law. If you're a Scientologist and you're performing electroshock therapy, that's A-okay, because it's a sincerely held religious belief. I don't think that we would be willing to expand our First Amendment jurisprudence that far. I do wonder whether the laws, like the law in Arizona that was vetoed, or the law in Mississippi that was recently passed, the RFRA laws, I do wonder whether they would protect that kind of behavior. I mean, RFRA says that the state has to have a compelling interest to encroach upon a sincerely held religious belief, right? If I'm a Scientologist and my sincerely held religious belief is that I need to administer shock therapy to my disciple, then why should the state have a compelling interest in preventing that if we're both consenting to it?
I don't know. It's a good question that I'll have to think about more. I think on the gay marriage case, I think we're mostly in agreement. That there is one part of your article that I think that I disagree with, and that's where you point out the hypocrisy of gay marriage opponents in this case, right? Basically saying that they're for religious liberty in all of these other cases, and why not this case? And I think that you're right to point to that as an example of hypocrisy. But then you go a step further and you question whether their belief in religious liberty is actually genuine, and point to this as evidence that perhaps it's not, that perhaps they invoke religious freedom just to have an excuse to invalidate gay marriage laws when it's convenient for them. And I don't think that that's quite right. I think that there's hypocrisy there, but that there's often hypocrisy when people really believe in a principle, but don't like some of the permutations. Right? There are plenty of people who have a genuine belief in free speech, but weren't on the side of the ACLU when they defended the Nazis marching, even though that is even though that is a logical outcome, even though I think that the ACLU is right in that case, and that the court came out the right way when the ACLU won, I don't think that invalidates the belief in free speech of the people who were against the Nazis marching. I just think that people are hypocrites sometimes because they're uncomfortable with the way things that come out. And I think that in the case of, another example, if we're throwing around hypotheticals, pro-choice people often talk about their belief in bodily autonomy and the right of a person to determine what happens to their body, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, many of these people are perfectly okay with laws that prohibit people from ingesting certain substances, say drugs, or that prohibit people from, say, selling their kidney for profit, right? That's no longer a my body, my choice kind of thing in their minds. I don't think that means that they don't believe in bodily autonomy. I just think it means that they have other conflicting beliefs and that they value them differently.
Sure. And so I would say that the point of my article was to highlight just how differently the religious liberty crowd seems to value the religious liberty of anti-gay people over the religious liberty of pro-gay people.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point.
Yeah, so I do think that that Ross Douthat and Molly Hemingway and the crowd of people who are writing in support of the Arizona law and of religious liberty laws, I think that they, when called upon, would agree with us that this North Carolina statute should be invalidated. I think they would agree that it's an encroachment upon the freedom of religious people. But I would note that neither of them has written a word in support of that lawsuit. Neither of them had written about it when this similar thing actually happened in New York, as I mentioned, in 2004. And they seem to be so heavily focused on religious liberty as it can be used as an excuse to invalidate pro-gay laws or to combat gay marriage or to combat gay rights. You know, this is the party line. We need religious liberty. Religious liberty is vital. Why is religious liberty vital? So that a storekeeper in Arizona can turn away a gay couple at the door. And that seems to be the end of the discussion. I would love to see more of the religious liberty crowd speaking out in support of people whose religious liberty maybe doesn't align with their political views. I would see a lot more consistency there. So I don't think...
Yeah, I think...
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know. I'm not ready to draw a conclusion about how consistent they've been yet, just because this is the first case like this that I've seen. I didn't know about it until you sent it to me. I think we will see more cases like this, and I think that you're right that the people who write about this issue a lot ought to take exactly the position that you're taking, that the religious liberty of these groups ought to be just as protected as the religious liberty of anti-gay marriage congregations. And I'd go a step farther, actually, as long as we're talking about religious liberty. I think another thing that we're going to see happen, because of the way the gay marriage fight has played out, there's been a lot of political interest among the right about protecting new laws to protect religious liberty. I think that insofar as these laws pass, and of course there are a lot of different ways you can word them, and my support for them would depend on the particulars, but insofar as these laws pass, a salutary benefit might be extending a little more protection than now exists to disfavored congregations, and I'm thinking particularly of Muslim Americans who are a target of a lot of civil liberties abuses in the United States right now. And I hope again that these religious Christians in the political realm who are pushing these laws, when it turns out that they're used by Muslim Americans or other religious minority groups for that matter, I hope that they're consistent in saying, yes, this behavior is protected, and no, we're not going to go the route of certain European countries, say, and banning the practices.
Oh God, yeah, like religion. Switzerland banning minarets. Well, I hope that we won't become true fascists. But yes, no, I mean, I entirely agree. And of course, America has a great history of this. Some of our best First Amendment cases were precipitated by Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Jehovah's Witnesses wouldn't raise their hand for the Pledge of Allegiance, wouldn't say live free or die on their license plates, right? And so, it was those principles of freedom that protected Jehovah's Witnesses that now protect all of us. So protection for some means protection for all. I'm entirely with you there, and I hope we see some consistency.
Yeah, and while we're on this subject, talk real quickly about this Oregon gay marriage lawsuit that you mentioned.
So I am a little bit torn about this lawsuit. So Oregon still bans gay marriage. It's a total anachronism because it's a fairly blue state. But the voters passed a gay marriage ban, and there's a federal lawsuit, and the attorney general of the state, who is a Democrat, refused to defend the gay marriage ban. She said, this ban is obviously a violation of the federal Constitution, of the 14th Amendment. I can't in good conscience defend it. Many have done that. Mark Herring in Virginia did that. Others have done it. So it's not that surprising. But the problem is that no group then stepped in and said, okay, well, if you won't defend it, Attorney General, we're going to defend it. And so you had this odd spectacle of a one-sided courtroom, right, where you have a team of lawyers attacking the gay marriage ban, saying, oh, this is unconstitutional, you must strike this down, and an empty table where there's no one there to say, oh no, this ban is constitutional, you should uphold it. Adding to the mix is the fact that the federal judge himself is openly gay and has a partner, which is just a quirky little side note. Right. And so you have this openly gay federal judge talking to a team of lawyers who are trying to strike down a marriage ban, and he is having to play devil's advocate. And he's having to say, but, under rational basis, shouldn't this ban survive? Aren't there real reasons to ban gay couples from getting married? And the whole thing is just a spectacle. And it comes across like a bit of a charade of justice. And I had not thus far really taken a stand on whether it's okay for attorney generals to stop defending their state's marriage bans. I mean, it seems sort of off the bat, it just seems like an okay thing to do if they really believe that it violates the Constitution. But this made me really reconsider, because I believe that every law deserves to have some defender, just like every single person deserves to have some defender. No matter how heinous the crime you're accused of, you deserve the best possible legal representation, right? I'm thrilled that the Defense of Marriage Act got really strong, really great defense by Paul Clement, because his defense allowed the court to then poke holes and to question him and to uncover the weaknesses of his defense. And without a Paul Clement figure arguing in favor of these gay marriage bans, then it just seems like too much of a foregone conclusion and too much like a charade of justice. So I was a little bit displeased to see that in Oregon.
Yeah, I think that this is a really thorny issue because, on one hand, I like the idea that the judiciary is not the only branch of government that is worried about whether a law is unconstitutional. I think that there are times that Congress ought to vote against a law that's proposed because they think that it's unconstitutional. I think that if the president takes an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and you can see how a president might feel obligated, or a governor, if there's a similar clause in an oath of office, might feel obligated to say, well, I took this oath, I can't execute this particular law because it's unconstitutional. Absolutely. And at the same time, you can see how this would become a recipe for a strange kind of nullification, right? Where a law is passed by an overwhelming majority, and everyone wants this law, and the governor or the president says, well, I think this is unconstitutional, and so any lawsuit against it suddenly becomes almost like veto power.
Right, right.
And I don't really know, beyond saying that there's political accountability, at least when office holders make these decisions, I don't really know which way I would go.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Of course, if the citizens of Oregon don't like what the Attorney General is doing, they can vote her out, right? I mean, that's not too hard. They'll have a chance to vote the ban down in 2014, and they almost certainly will if this federal judge doesn't strike it down. But you're absolutely right that the Attorney General of every state swears to uphold the state constitution and the federal constitution. What do you do when it seems that there is a direct conflict between the two? But of course, the thing that worries me is you can imagine an obvious hypothetical of the reverse. The state of Texas passes a law mandating the legalization of gay marriage. This is in an alternate universe where Texans are totally pro-gay marriage, right?
Yeah.
And a group comes along and says, this violates our First Amendment rights. We have a free exercise right to not live in a state with gay marriage. And the Attorney General agrees with them. Well, then you have this law that, good liberals all like and agree with, and an Attorney General who refuses to defend it, and it would cause widespread outrage, and we would all be totally upset. And so it concerns me that the reason I'm okay with this gay marriage lawsuit having no defender is because I don't like the law. What happens when there's a law I do like, and no one will come along to defend it? It sets a very alarming precedent.
And how does I'm ignorant about this? How does it work? Where in California, if my memory is correct, it was an outside group, not the state, that was representing the state.
So after the Prop 8 case, this is a really thorny issue because the Supreme Court said in Prop 8, right, that the way that this group was designated to defend Prop 8 was unconstitutional, that they didn't have standing to defend this lawsuit. And so after the federal judge struck it down, that was the end of it. When the Attorney General refused to defend it, that was the end of it. But California has a kind of unique system. Every state has a slightly different system. So it's unclear now who does have standing to step in and defend a lawsuit. What is clear is that if a group of legislators in the state want to step in and defend their own state's law, that seems to be okay, because that's what happened with DOMA, right? There was BLAG, the bipartisan legal group, which was not really bipartisan, it was all Republicans. And they came together, they were all Republican representatives, and they said, we're going to defend DOMA because Eric Holder won't. And the Supreme Court said, fine, that's perfectly fine. You're legislators, you have a real vested interest in this, it's a live case, so we'll let you defend it. But allowing private citizens to defend a state law when the Attorney General won't seems troubling. Now, there's another issue here, which is that the National Organization for Marriage, our old friends at NOM, have decided at the very last minute in Oregon, they decided that, in fact, they wanted to intervene, and they wanted to defend the Oregon ban. And they did so almost certainly to delay a ruling. There seems to be no other explanation. We have known for months and months that the Attorney General wouldn't defend the Oregon ban. She announced it a very long time ago. There has been all the time in the world for NOM to step in. The fact that they only did so on the eve of the court proceedings seems to strongly imply that it's just a dilatory tactic.
Right. Huh.
So, a lot of wrinkles in the case.
Yeah, the one case where having legislators step in and defend it, if any will step up and do so, seems to be a pretty good solution. If you can't find even a single state legislator to defend something, it's a pretty good sign that it's not popular enough to stand anyway. The one case that I would be a little bit worried of that, though, is just in the case of ballot initiatives, right? If we have this vehicle for the people to pass laws over the objections of the legislature, or the objections of their political leadership, and just directly do it themselves, it seems like in those cases the people ought to be able to step in and defend those laws and have standing based on the fact that that the people passed this. And sort of advocate of that sort.
So 4 members of the Supreme Court agree with you, but 5 do not, and that's where we are now. Emily Bazelon also has similarly conflicting views on this. I do as well. It does seem like the citizens in California who defended Prop 8 did not have any real injury, but then again, they voted for this measure and saw it struck down, so perhaps they did have an injury as concerned citizens in California. I think it's really debatable, and it doesn't cut along clear ideological lines. I mean, you saw the Supreme Court splinter on this question in a totally bizarre manner. I think you had 3 liberals and 2 conservatives deciding that the people couldn't defend the law. You had the rest on the other side. It was just a total scramble. So there's no easy solution here. But I agree that it presents a pretty interesting question of when do the people have a true concrete injury if they've seen their own initiative overturned by the judiciary?
Yeah, and I tend to think in areas of constitutional law, it's generally a good thing when they're able to get adjudicated. I understand the prudence of having standing rules. At the same time, there are so many cases that frustrate me tremendously. One example to get off of same-sex marriage for a minute is the Anwar al-Awlaki case, where this guy is put on a kill list, right? And drones are perhaps circling over him at that very moment, ready to pull the trigger. And his father steps in and says, I want to challenge the constitutionality of this, and basically decided he doesn't have standing to do so.
Yeah. He has no concrete injury, right? He hasn't been killed yet. What's he complaining about?
Exactly. And there's also this sort of constant lament of civil libertarians, right, that a lot of times the only time that we get to adjudicate issues that are important to us is when there's some terrible villain, right? There's someone
right.
who goes and murders 3 people, and then he's caught in an illegal traffic stop, right? And that's where we have to defend the Fourth Amendment instead of being able to defend a general principle in a case that's not tied to a horrendous criminal. And I think that perhaps over the decades has skewered a lot of especially a lot of rights that play with the criminal justice system.
Right. So like every Fourth Amendment case is either a drug case or a firearm case, right? Because that's what people are hiding. And so it's very hard to say, oh yes, I want to exclude this evidence of this drug dealer who shot 5 people because it was unconstitutionally seized. It's a very hard line to draw.
Yeah. Well, so let's move on to another sort of villain that no one wants to defend. Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, as a long time Los Angeles resident or Southern California resident, I've got to say that Donald Sterling is such a hated figure locally, both for basketball reasons and for non-basketball reasons. And for those unfamiliar, of course, he was so. As I understand it, a person, perhaps his mistress, was angry with him and was recording him surreptitiously.
Yes, and perhaps illegally.
Yeah, and I think if it was in California, certainly illegally, because California is a state where you can't record someone without telling them. And he was caught on tape basically saying that he objected to this woman taking black people, appearing in her Instagram photos and taking them to Clippers games, and apparently Magic Johnson, the most popular icon of Southern California sports and perhaps the most likable LA sports figure ever, he objected to this person coming to Clipper games, which seems so cartoonishly racist and insane that like, I don't know.
I loved the mistress's defense, though. She said, well, I know that you generally don't like black people, but I figured it would be okay if it's Magic Johnson, right? I mean, you can't be racist against Magic Johnson. Of course not. But alas, he was. You know, that's the twist.
He was. So racist that even Magic Johnson. I don't know. So what the latest seems to be that the NBA has decided it's going to fine him $2.5 million and try to strip him of ownership of the Clippers. Yes. And this is kind of a weird area, you know. In just about any other business, you'd never be able to just sort of decide to take the business from the owner because he was racist. But the NBA has all of these sort of strange rules in its constitution, some of which are secret, I believe, and there are all sorts of sort of weird, heavy-handed things that the NBA can do both to its players and to other owners to sanction them. So I think that for that reason, it's a little bit easier to look at this case as kind of an individual, unique situation as opposed to a precedent that's going to be set in businesses generally. Perhaps this might influence what other sports leagues do, but I can't imagine that it's going to bleed into like non-sports businesses. But that said, what do you think about this $2.5 million fine and the idea of taking the franchise away from Donald Sterling?
So I know it was widely praised. Everybody said this was, I think his name is Silver, the NBA commissioner. Everyone said this is absolutely the right move. There was a lot of concern that there was going to be a half measure, some kind of smaller fine, and maybe a suspension. And I sensed a sort of sigh of relief across the internet when it turned out that Sterling would just be out of the picture. It does concern me a little that he was afforded no due process. I mean, even in the entirely, privatized business arena of the NBA, it strikes me as kind of odd that they just took these recordings from, was it TMZ that broke the news and said, oh, okay, here, this is you saying racist things. We're going to fine you for an immense amount of money and strip you of your own property. That was a little alarming to me. But I don't really know what the rules are. Like you said, maybe none of us really know what the rules are. I know there are some secret rules. Maybe there's a star court that, afforded him a little more due process. But it is a little weird that it happened so quickly and just with no one ever even stepping up to defend him. It was just, all right, Sterling, you're out, you're gone.
Right. Yeah. And then there was also this wrinkle of... So Bomani Jones is someone who has written, I think 10 or 12 years ago, about Donald Sterling's kind of extra NBA business activities, which included being a landlord who was sued for racial discrimination and is alleged to have had just terribly racist practices. I mean, again,
can we just note as a side note the wonderfully whimsical type of racism he practiced? I believe he said that he would only lease to Koreans in Koreatown because they're the only ones who will pay their rent, which is just such a strange kind of racist belief. It must have been organic to Sterling. I've never heard anything like that before, but that's how racism works, I guess.
Well, this is actually, I mean, this is partly explained by the weird dynamics of, I don't know exactly when this was, but if it was like, depending on the timing, right, Sterling's landlord activities coincided with the LA riots and this time when there was this huge tension between Korean Americans and African Americans in Los Angeles. A lot of Korean American stores were torched during the riots, and on the other side, a lot of African Americans said that Korean store owners were racist and were always, watching them in particularly egregious ways when they were in their stores. So there's a lot of tension there. And so, you can even imagine, right, a landlord who kind of had this property and wanted to have it be either all African American or all Korean American, right, in certain neighborhoods to avoid the kind of tensions that were present then, which isn't to say that discriminating against either group would have been justified, but you could sort of understand at least a little bit if an owner would have done that. But no, Donald Sterling was just really, his comments were just, again, the most cartoonishly racist, unforgivable things, or indefensible, I should say, things that you can imagine.
Yes.
And if the allegations are accurate, right, he obviously broke fair housing rules. He obviously contributed to a really pernicious and terrible problem when it comes to the ability of people to find housing, segregation of neighborhoods, all of these problems. So Bomani Jones broke this story 10 or 12 years ago, and after this latest countertest with Donald Sterling, he went on a sports radio show and basically said, I have a hard time getting upset about these latest Donald Sterling remarks. He basically said, which isn't to say they aren't egregious, but I can't help but just kind of laugh at how cartoonishly racist they are. And also at the same time say, where were you all 10 or 12 years ago when this other thing happened that to Bomani Jones's lights was much more pernicious as far as its effects on society than Donald Sterling's views about the Clippers, And I think that his point is well taken, that you have this pernicious problem. You have low-income housing residents who are being discriminated against and affecting their lives in a way that is just categorically different from anything that, say, a Clippers player might suffer under Donald Sterling. Now, of course, Donald Sterling owning a franchise, he doesn't just control the players. He controls, employees that are, working the hot dog stand, presumably, at the Clippers arena. At the Staples Center. Perhaps, I don't actually know if he controls those people, but he has the NBA players themselves are very highly paid and have a very strong union to protect them. And so on the spectrum of how powerful employees are and how protected they are, they're pretty high up on any kind of relative social ladder, right? The Clippers presumably have lots of employees who do not enjoy those same protections. So I don't want to minimize that. But I think it's safe to say that Donald Sterling's housing activities have much more far-reaching and pernicious effects on society than his private comments that were then spilled onto the internet do. And so it's interesting that on one hand we have this taboo against egregiously racist speech, right? That I think the vast majority of Americans are generally okay with this taboo against racism, against African Americans especially, and really racism generally. And this taboo is a good thing, I think everyone agrees. At the same time, here you have a case where one effect of enforcing this taboo, which people generally want to exist, is a kind of mismatch between seeming to ignore this other behavior that's more egregious and policing this really kind of easy case where this cartoonish villain comes along and says something and everyone can get all upset about it, and does this kind of national cycle of getting outraged about these comments does it make everyone feel like, oh, well, I did my part for anti-racism. I got appropriately angry when Donald Sterling said these things, and kind of not have to address much thornier and less clear instances of racism that actually matter a lot more in the real world.
Yes, I mean, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. Just an unqualified yes. This is so easy to condemn. It is so easy to say, oh my God, you are a horrible racist human being. You have said the most, like you said, cartoonishly evil things. Anyone can see that those are horrible things to say, right? It's so much harder to look at, long-term rental discrimination, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's so much harder to address the really complex, the really nuanced forms that racism takes in our society. And so it's almost like it's cathartic for Americans to condemn the cartoon racist and then completely ignore all of the other racists who are running around doing horribly racist things, but doing it using agreed upon code words, right? Doing it in more subtle ways, and so we just decide to ignore that collectively. Now, you talked about taboo. I wonder, do you think it would be better for us to sort of drop this taboo of talking about race and talking about racism in order to let people with more subtle forms of racism sort of air their grievances in public?
Um, hmm. Maybe. I'm generally very suspicious of taboo and stigma. I think this is largely because I grew up and went to Catholic school for 14 years, and the first times I encountered taboo and stigma were people talking about issues like sex before marriage, and I just saw the way in which humans, by my lights, um, can be very earnest about thinking that a behavior is damaging, but are very bad at applying taboo and stigma in a way that has salutary effects, are very bad at applying it in a way that is appropriately kind to human weakness, are very bad. I just think it's abused. I think we're not very good at taboo and stigma, and that we're better off generally relying on persuasion and reason. I think that there are certain practices, right? Racial slurs are an example of something that I think ought to be taboo and ought to continue to be stigmatized, right? But I do think that a cost of this taboo about racism is definitely that people tiptoe around race, and there are these attitudes that are not cartoonishly racist in the way Donald Sterling's comments are, but that are objectionable in certain ways, and that might be perhaps these views would be better addressed by a kind of robust public conversation where the actual logic behind them is attacked and people are persuaded over time, rather than kind of driving them underground so that they're never discussed. And I think there's also something, I think Adam Serwer has written about this, although I can't remember the particular piece, so I may have that wrong. But there's a sense in which it would be nice if you could say to someone, hey, I think this thing you're doing, or this thing you said, or this belief you have is racially objectionable, or is racially insensitive, without putting upon them the full stigma of capital R racism, right?
Right.
Because it just shuts down all conversation, and because there are degrees of racism. I mean, I think that despite my belief that there are more subtle forms of racism that are far more damaging in society than Donald Sterling's cartoonish comments, right? I also think that there's good reason to have a bigger stigma against cartoonishly racist, like actually consciously hateful speech, than it is to have someone who holds some belief that has kind of more complicated motivations, and they earnestly try not to be a hateful person in life, but they have this kind of objectionable belief that on an aggregate scale has these really terrible consequences. But, I'm interested in persuading that person and changing their behavior. I'm interested in solving the problem. I'm not nearly as interested in casting that person off into some kind of dark other place
Right.
for the Donald Sterlings of the world.
Right. So there's an analogy here definitely to gay rights.
Yeah,
And of course,
absolutely.
as a gay writer, I'm contractually obliged to mention gay rights every 20 minutes. But so, I mean, it's very clear that there's currently in many realms of society a stigma against saying outwardly homophobic things. You would never,
Uh-huh.
in most parts of Washington, D.C. or most parts of New York, you would never say, I think that gay marriage is wrong, I think it's morally reprehensible, blah, 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 blah. There's a stigma against saying that. You think gay intimacy is disgusting, right? You just don't say things like that. Even in conservative parts of the country, that seems to be an increasingly verboten thing to say. I,
Mhm.
I kind of appreciate that because I feel like people aren't born homophobic, and one of the reasons that this most recent generation is much less homophobic is because they just haven't been exposed to homophobia as much. And so on the one hand, I do like that you will rarely hear people say, gay sex is disgusting and immoral, or gay marriage is grotesque. And I think that there's a very big benefit to that in that you get less homophobia traveling downward, trickling downward through the generations. On
Mhm.
the other hand, I am very well aware that it was stigma, a similar stigma against talking about your hatred of gays. It was a stigma that kept gay rights from progressing for a very long time because there was just a stigma against acknowledging the existence of gay people. I think the New York Times didn't talk about gay people openly until like the 80s because its editors were afraid to. In a lot of parts of the country, you just didn't talk about such things, right? It was stigmatized. And even
Mhm.
if you did, it was only in coded language and shrouded euphemisms and that kind of thing. And
Mhm.
that obviously held gay rights back, right? And so I wonder, would it be better at this point to just let everyone air their grievances, to let everybody say, I think gay marriage is horrible and wrong, and I think gay intimacy is disgusting, and then tell them, I don't think you're right, and here are the reasons why, and persuade them with reason? Or is it better at this point to just keep really rampant homophobia cabined to a particular segment of society, to keep it cabined to, honestly, a demographic that's dying out? I'm really not sure. I'm torn about this, as I sense you might be in a similar way about talking about racism. However, I do think that the point of talking about when something is racially insensitive rather than something spoken by a racist is an
Mhm.
important distinction to keep. It's definitely important to note that let's say Sterling, definitely a racist, right? Absolutely a racist.
He's an easy
Someone
case.
who someone who opposes affirmative action, even someone who, like I recently saw, I think 45% of white Americans think that black people don't work as hard. Maybe they have racist views. They have racially insensitive views. But if you immediately write them off as racist, you're never going to change their minds because you're never going to engage with them. And so stigmatizing their beliefs is probably not the best way to change their minds. I agree with you there.
Um, there's this interesting thread to this where you have. I haven't seen very many people discuss how they feel about this mistress of Donald Sterling uh, kind of carrying out this action, right? And again, there's this kind of, on the one hand, um, it's it's probably a good thing to be reminded every once in a while that people like Donald Sterling still exist and still wield power, because I certainly haven't encountered anyone like him, at least as far as I know. Uh, in my life, I've never heard anyone say anything close to what he said, even in private. And yet this clearly exists, and clearly he has a social circle of his own, and probably there are people in it who are like him. So um, it's useful to be reminded, I suppose, that there is that there are people like him out there. On the other hand, um, you know, I kind of feel like probably a lot of racism is going to die out with his generation, and uh, to what degree is it just needlessly hurting people to catch people of this generation and like in private moments and then broadcast that and so there's I don't know, I'm kind of torn about that. Um, I also feel like in general, right, I'm against uh, people who are involved in like lawsuits or personal disputes trying to bait people into saying things that they're going to record secretly and then spread in order to hurt them. I think that most people are generally uncomfortable with that. Again, it's hard to it's hard to come away from the Sterling incident thinking that that's the main thing that we ought to focus on, given the kind of terribleness of what he said. And it's especially hard to feel sorry for him because he was kind of already revealed to be a racist by his housing actions.
Right.
And so it's not as if we found out some dark secret. It's just that people started paying attention. But as with all things, this woman sensed this power dynamic that she could leverage. And I think it would be naive to think that after this Donald Sterling episode, no one is going to leverage this same dynamic in a case that we're going to be a lot less comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, it was a super weird background situation because, like you said, he's engaged in a divorce and there's some kind of lawsuit going on, and of course she's a mistress, and I never really understood it. I'm sorry, it was a little too much for me. But I mean, you're right that it's weird that we all sort of ignored all of the background. We said, let's just take it as a given. We have these recordings and go from there. We never really questioned, how did these recordings come to light? Was this a violation of California law, which it almost certainly was. Yeah, we just moved in immediately for the kill. So that's certainly an issue. Your other point about, was Donald Sterling maybe just a senile old bastard? I think that's well taken. I think if you recorded every 80-year-old's private musings, I regret to say, especially every 80-year-old wealthy white American's private musings, I regret to say that most of them won't have the most enlightened views about racial relations. Or
I mean, I actually think that, take like an 80-year-old of any race, like a lot of them are going to be perfectly wonderful people, but a lot of them are also going to have like crotchety old man views.
Yes. Old people can be really, really, really bitchy and cranky. And it's just because they're old sometimes. Now, Donald Sterling, I think he transgressed the "he's just an old man" line. I mean, he moved so far. With the Magic Johnson quip, that was just a little too far. But I mean, I think your point is definitely well taken, that he's an old senile jerk. And so maybe we shouldn't extrapolate too much about what this means for race and race relations in America. Maybe this is not like the best example to hold up as problematic racial statements when it was said by an 80-year-old wealthy white man.
Yeah, and again, Sterling isn't the best example of this, but when you were talking before about racism, about anti-gay sentiment, right, and where we ought to draw these taboo lines, and I think everyone agrees that we ought to draw them somewhere. You could have widespread agreement that we shouldn't have, again, anti-gay slurs or racist slurs, right? And then on the other hand, there's this whole spectrum, and everyone draws the line in a different place. One thing that I have started to notice, and that kind of concerns me, and maybe we won't discuss it, but we'll put a link up to this Freddie DeVore piece that I sent to you. I worry that the conversation in digital media, in magazine journalism, in academia about these issues of race and gender and sexuality, right? I worry that people like you and me exist in a kind of insular world where, we went to colleges that talked about these issues in a particular way and were attuned to the sensitivities of people who read magazines like Slate and
the Atlantic.
Yeah. And we are, conversant in different hashtags and memes and concepts that come up around gender and race. And we know what it means when someone hashtags something privilege or hashtags something mansplaining, right? Or, and so I think that oftentimes it's easy to forget that this is a small subculture, and that if you went up to the average person on the street with one of these hashtags or names, they would have no idea what concept you're actually talking about, right? And they would, in fact, have different norms of what it is sensitive to say, right? They came up, say someone came up in some high school that doesn't send a lot of people to college, and went straight from that to some kind of a trade school and has worked ever since as a mechanic, right? This person is existing in a totally different world than someone who went to prep school and then Harvard, say. And
Right.
and so I worry that we are often substituting this like exquisitely particular way of talking about race that is endemic to that's part of our subculture, right? And then we're looking at these other people who are outside of this subculture and misjudging their degree of racism, racial enlightenment, homophobia, sexism, right? And I guess one way, the way that this bothers me the most, right? Let's take someone who I have huge disagreements with, Joe Arpaio, right? I think I don't know if I mentioned this before in a Blogging Heads, right? But Joe Arpaio seems to me this indefensible figure. I've written a lot about the things that he's done to minorities in Maricopa County, and he's been sued for civil rights violations before, and he's kind of a villain in our corner of the media, right? And then you have someone like Michael Bloomberg, who I would argue has carried out a lot of the same objectionable kinds of practices against minorities. If you're Black or Latino in parts of New York, you've gotten thrown against a wall, even though you're innocent of any wrongdoing and not really even suspected of anything because of policies that Michael Bloomberg defends to this day. If you were a Muslim American student in New York City, you perhaps had an undercover agent come and spy on you when you were going on a river rafting trip with your college class, right? Because of policies that Michael Bloomberg defends to this day. And Michael Bloomberg is kind of acculturated into this world that I'm talking about, and he is able to talk about these issues with the vocabulary of, say, an Ivy League graduate. Joe Arpaio, culturally, is a red state guy who speaks about things in a different way. Now, in this case, I don't think that Joe Arpaio is getting the raw end of any deal. I think that he's being appropriately stigmatized. But I think that Michael Bloomberg is getting away with the same behavior because he's able to because he's part of this, because he's acculturated in this certain way, and because he's a guy in a suit who owns a business and is very successful, and and I think that this is a danger that that we get away from substance and we focus too much on the kind of cultural norms and sensitivities in a way that becomes disconnected from reality.
Yeah, so I will say first that the Freddie DeBoer piece specifically talked about feminism, and I think that this is especially problematic for feminism because feminism was one of the first smaller movements to have an outsized voice on the internet. I think that web feminism is a huge booming industry. Every feminist seems to be tech savvy. I'm a feminist. I would consider myself tech savvy. And feminism has become very familiar with various kinds of internet argot and the patois of millennials that just almost excludes at the door anybody who doesn't know the vocabulary right off the bat. So I think that's a huge problem for feminism, and I think it's becoming a really big problem for the LGBT community. I think the trans community is becoming very entrenched in its own language and its own norms, and I think the same is true for the gay community in general. So that's a big issue. But your broader question about Mike Bloomberg's racism being appropriately coded is certainly accurate. I mean, I am not a fan of Mike Bloomberg, so I won't step in to defend him full-throatedly. But I think it's so true. He implemented stop and frisk, one of the most insanely racist and unconstitutional policies in New York's history, and he is championed as a liberal hero because he was able to stand at various podiums in his very fancy clothes and say, this is an effort for us to stop street crime and protect people, right? And then the Arizona sheriff comes in and says, I don't like Mexicans, and does the same thing, and implements virtually identical policies with cars rather than with people, and he is bemoaned as this horrible, hideous, cartoonishly racist figure. I don't like either person, so I'm not inclined to step in and defend either one.
Yeah.
But you're right that it's an issue. We let certain kinds of racist conduct slide because we otherwise like the person who's doing it, or we like the way he's dressing up his racism.
Yeah, and this is partly also, the incentive of digital journalism is sometimes to frame things in a way that sparks people's outrage, or to frame things in a way that that casts ourselves as part of an enlightened in-group that is writing. And of course we know, we enlightened people know these things that these other unenlightened people don't know, and let's just I think that it's easy for everyone to do. I find myself having to make sure I don't do that when I'm writing about something like torture, where I feel like, God, this is
so
a
obvious
horrific practice. This is a taboo that we had that has gone away, and I think that the taboo is the right thing, and it still exists a little bit, and it's tempting to just play on that. And I always try to remind myself, like, no, you have to, have lots of content in this article that is aimed at persuading people who aren't as repulsed about waterboarding as I am, right? Include the arguments in there. It can be hard to do depending on the issue and depending on but I really think that on issues of race and gender, persuasion is a really important thing in journalism, because ultimately journalists are but a small percentage of people talking about these issues, and the stigmas that we were talking about, should they exist, should they not exist, where are the lines drawn, it isn't really something that we particularly determine as individual writers, right? But we're kind of the only ones out there persuading and trying to operate in that mode, in this mode of public discourse. If that's not happening in journalism, it's not really going to happen anywhere. And so I think it's a good thing generally for journalists to be guardians of that kind of, Habermasian, to use to invoke the philosopher who writes about public discourse. That ought to be the major part of what journalists do. At least that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's a very thoughtful summary of what our positions are. I think we have more responsibility than most of us realize. We're given a great platform. A lot of people read Slate, a lot of people read The Atlantic, and it's very easy to just sort of spew out our personal views and just presume that all of our readers are going to agree with us, because honestly, most of our readers are going to. If there are loyal readers, then they probably generally like what we have to say. But we do have a responsibility to reach out to the people who aren't our loyal readers and to mount the best case possible for our argument in terms that anyone could understand, not just people who are totally enmeshed in this subculture that we constantly operate in. I agree.
And let's close with a last topic real quick. There was a blogging head that I was watching the other day between Michael Brendan Doherty and Freddie DeBoer, and they were talking about polygamy. And for a little bit of background, Michael Brendan Doherty is basically an Orthodox Catholic who loves the Latin Mass and is kind of a traditionalist paleoconservative. Freddie DeBoer is a secular atheist, and they had this kind of strange agreement on the subject of polygamy, where Freddie thinks that it should be legal, and Michael Brendan Doherty does not think that it should be legal. Freddie thinks that it would be a good thing if it were legal, and Michael Brendan Doherty doesn't. But they both kind of agreed that there was no secular logic that they could point to, no reason to ban it, given the direction that the marriage equality fight has gone. They don't think that they're and this is, of course, an argument that conservatives made back before gay marriage. The marriage equality side was kind of winning. They said, oh, if we legalize this, then polygamy is next. And a lot of gay marriage proponents like me said, well, no, that's not necessarily true, and that's certainly not logically true. You don't have to follow one with the other. I still believe that there are logical secular ways to differentiate these two things. Do you think that? Do you agree with them, or do you agree with me?
So I agree with you. I think it's very important for us to define our terms here, though. I think that there is absolutely no good argument for legally forbidding three or more people from living together,
Yeah,
from
I agree.
engaging in intimacy. I think that that's a very clear constitutional command. I think the liberty guaranteed by the 14th Amendment encompasses the liberty to have sex with and live with however many people you want. So what we're talking about here, I presume, is the legal recognition of such unions. The question here is whether the state should be compelled to recognize a marriage between three people. I think that the easy answer for why it shouldn't is a reevaluation of the argument for gay marriage, right? The idea behind the argument for gay marriage is that gay people are a protected class. We are a minority. We have a certain inborn characteristic, which is our sexual orientation, that should be protected by the law, which means that any law that targets us and disfavors us should receive heightened scrutiny. So a law that forbids us from marrying the person we love should receive heightened scrutiny, and the state should have to provide a pretty good reason for why that law needs to exist. No state has ever really given a good reason, so marriage equality is a pretty clear constitutional command. I think that the idea that polygamists are a protected class, the notion that polygamy or laws against polygamy should receive heightened scrutiny is sort of ridiculous. I've never heard it. I've never heard it made in a convincing way. I mean, if you are a polygamist, that's a choice.
I've never heard it made either, but and it is a choice to be a polygamist. I agree, but at the same time, right? Polygamists are a group that has pretty directly suffered some pretty heavy-handed and awful treatment, right? You were talking before about that we both agree that people ought to be able to live and have intimacy in a house with 3 people, 5 people, whatever they want. Polygamists have certainly been targeted and deprived of that right in a pretty systematic way by the state historically. So I don't think it's. I mean, I'm not actually advocating that polygamists get protected status as a protected group. I'd have to think more about that, but I don't think it's ridiculous on its face, given that they have been targeted and discriminated against and deprived of rights that both of us agree that they ought to have.
Well, I don't know. I mean, perhaps it's not ridiculous. Perhaps I've just never heard a non-ridiculous argument mounted. There might be a good one out there. But I think that the history of discrimination against polygamists isn't quite as rampant. And there's just not... There haven't been a ton of states who have all gotten together and decided to target polygamists in any way other than outlawing polygamy in the way that gay people have been systematically targeted. There isn't that kind of history in the United States. And further, I just, the fact that polygamy is a choice seems to decide the issue for me. You have to choose to want to have sex with 2 people constantly, to want to live with 2 other people constantly, even if it's something that you're gravitating toward. It's still something that you ultimately, it's a personal decision. You're the one who decides to do it. Whereas if you're gay, it's pretty well established. You are born gay. It's just who you are. And you want to spend your life with someone of the same sex. That's just the hand you were dealt. You can't choose to change your orientation in the way that you can choose to settle for one partner for life. So it just seems to me
in other words, the way I would put it is that if you're gay, then if you're going to enjoy anything like an equivalent right to marry, you have to be able to do it with the person that you're attracted to, that you want to be intimate with, that you want to share your life with.
That's right.
And but I think I kind of on the larger question, I think I get to the same answer in a different way, and it's this: that part of the I sort of agree with the equal protection arguments for gay marriage, but the main reason that I wanted gay marriage to be legal is because I think that it's a salutary thing both for gays and for society, right? I want gay people to be able to enjoy the same benefits of marriage that I think that straight people get out of it. And I also think that society in general benefits from the stability that the institution of marriage brings. I would argue that part of the stability of marriage is owed to the two-person nature of it, and that adding a third person, it seems to me, would radically destabilize these relationships, right? I mean, if you talk about the pace at which these relationships dissolve, right? However many people you add to them is obviously just mathematically going to increase the potential for them to break apart. And I would also argue that, it's pretty clear in human nature that we can be jealous of one another's relationships. You can imagine, right, if you were talking about, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I tentatively agree with you. My hesitation is that so many of those arguments in slightly modified form were made against gay marriage that I'm sort of gun shy. You hear, it'll destabilize all of marriage. The marriages themselves won't last. Gay people.
I don't think it'll. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll destabilize all marriages.
Just those marriages. Okay, fair enough. But you also saw the argument, gay people have been proven to not be able to stay in unions for as long. Gay people can't be monogamous, blah, 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 blah. You heard so many sort of slanderously anti-gay qualms there that I'm hesitant to bring my opposition to legalized polygamy to a personal level, and I'd rather just keep it at a sort of abstract level. Well, are they constitutionally, are we constitutionally required to allow for polygamous marriages? No, we are not. That's where I would draw the line.
Yeah, I would argue that my arguments weren't personalized. That it's to say on one hand that gay people are more promiscuous or less able to have stable relationships than straight people, right? That's a very different claim than saying three people of any orientation, three individuals generally are less able to have stable relationships than two people, right?
That's true. That's just arithmetic.
Yeah. I think it's arithmetic. It's not distinguishing between different types of humans and asserting general characteristics or discriminatory beliefs. It's just to say, one, that the more people you add to a contract, the more people can want out of it at some point. And
basic contract law.
And two, if you believe that humans generally are jealous, then that would seem to be a factor that would decrease the stability in a union that involved sex, not just between a pair of people, but between three different people. It's not to say that there can never be a successful union of a polygamous trio, or I'm going to have to study up on my ascending number pairs. If
do we say thruple? That's what the New York Post said, but thruple feels all wrong to me. I don't like thruple. I prefer trio.
Yes,
how about troika?
That. So, but yeah, I think that the state has the whole reason. It gets into a question of why do we have the state involved in marriage at all, right? And some libertarians say, I don't think the state should be involved in marriage at all. That's their kind of solution to all of these problems. It is just, to me, marriage is a civil contract, and the state is involved in this particular contract partly because lots of people want it, and it's easy to have like this standard thing that lots of people want instead of everyone drawing up their own contracts, which even libertarians think that they should be able to do. But it's partly, and this is where I part ways with libertarians on this issue, there's partly this kind of advantage of having this traditional institution that is meaningful to people. And when my wife and I decided to get married, when gay partners decide to get married, we're joining this institution and by virtue of joining it, the tradition gives us a kind of extra incentive to stability, right? Because this institution seems weightier, has a longer tradition than if we were to just get some kind of equivalent contract that was unique to us. If you buy the notion that the state is involved in marriage partly because it brings benefits to people and the stability that it brings to people, the financial stability, the emotional stability, is a good thing, then I think that if you think that polygamous marriages would be less stable, if that's a compelling argument, then I think that you can draw the line there. And that's why I disagree with Freddie and Michael, that there is this logical reason to draw the line.
Connor, I'm surprised you're such a romantic. I never would have guessed it. No, I mean, I agree with you there. I think that's a beautiful defense of traditional marriage. I'm doing air quotes here. Marriage in the sense of a contract between two people. I think it's absolutely correct. I might steal that logic from you the next time someone challenges me to defend my views on polygamy. But I completely agree. It's a contract between two people at bottom. The state has a very rational, compelling interest in preserving it in the status quo of being a civil contract between two people. Add a third person, it gets way too messy, and the state shouldn't be forced to have to deal with all of that. I completely agree.
All right. Well, I think we can end there. It's been enjoyable again, and look forward to whatever you put up next at Slate.
All right. Until next time.